welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. The vanishing billions of Wirecard. No one expected fireworks at the annual shareholders' meeting in Munich that mild April morning. The coffee smelled faintly of roasted almonds, the hall lights glowed a comfortable amber, and Wirecard CEO Markus Braun paced to the lectern with the serene stride of a man who believed the future was already in his pocket. From the stage he wove a sleek tale: contactless payments surging in Asia, encrypted wallets in Africa, a cashless paradise stretching across 5 continents, each new territory sealed, it seemed, by Wirecard's proprietary alchemy. The crowd applauded politely. Many had been applauding for years. Yet beneath the applause, a quieter rhythm had begun to beat. It started in 2015 when a short-selling analyst in London noticed a puzzling pattern. Wirecard's Asian subsidiaries, which generated nearly half its proclaimed earnings, filed almost no public documentation. Their office addresses led to serviced co-working rooms or shuttered mailboxes. Each time the analyst flagged a discrepancy, Braun's spokespeople brushed it off with the fetal calm of a practiced yogi. Growth, they said, was faster than paperwork. Across the channel, in the cramped offices of the Financial Times, reporter Dan McCrum scanned Wirecard's numbers with the fascination of a detective handed a diary written in disappearing ink. Months of tracing invoices led him to a small payment processor in Manila. The office was an apartment above a bakery. The CEO, a retiree with a phone that rarely rang. Yet Wirecard statements credited this ghost firm with €300 million in annual revenue. McCrum wrote a cautious exposé. Wirecard stock wobbled, then rebounded. Within hours, Braun's legal team accused the FT of market manipulation, and German regulators opened an investigation into the journalists, not the company. For ordinary investors, the message was clear: nothing to see here. Pension funds, retail traders, even the venerable Deutsche Bank poured cash into Wirecard shares. Politicians hailed the firm as proof that Germany could spawn a Silicon Valley unicorn. And still, the enigmas multiplied. Cash balances jumped by hundreds of millions overnight. Auditors signed off, then quietly requested clarifications that never arrived. Each query was met with a blizzard of glossy slide decks, all growth curves and smiling merchants. By 2019, the pressure cooker hissed. KPMG, hired for a special audit, asked for straightforward proof: bank confirmations for €1.9 billion supposedly held in trustee accounts in the Philippines. Wirecard's finance chief, Jan Marsalek, produced scanned PDFs on corporate letterhead that looked pristine, too pristine. KPMG asked for originals. Weeks passed. When documents finally arrived, they bore digital time stamps from the day after the request, not the years in which the deposits were claimed. Still, Braun radiated equanimity, assuring analysts the matter was a misunderstanding of Asian banking customs. On the outskirts of Munich, a mid-level officer at Germany's financial watchdog, BaFin, began his own quiet review. He phoned the Bank of the Philippine Islands, the institution listed on the trustee letters. The voice on the other end hesitated, then confirmed the nightmare. No such accounts existed. The €1.9 billion was a phantom. The German officer's notes from that call later formed the spine of an emergency briefing to the finance ministry. It was June 17, 2020. The next morning, auditors from EY refused to sign Wirecard's annual report. Braun ordered an emergency press conference. Cameras clicked, shareholders perched on the edge of their streaming screens. With remarkable calm, Braun stated that documentation may have been forged. The stock went into free fall, shedding 70% of its value before lunch. Retail investors watched decades of savings evaporate in real time. That evening, Jan Marsalek vanished. His last known act was ordering a private jet from Vienna to Minsk under an alias. Border cameras captured him stepping onto the tarmac with a small backpack and a half-smile. He hasn't been seen since. In the days that followed, prosecutors stormed Wirecard's headquarters, hauling away servers and laptops. Inside Braun's minimalist office, investigators found white boards filled with flowcharts of shell companies spanning Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and Dubai. Money, it appeared, had ricocheted through these entities faster than any regulator could track, leaving behind only clipped signatures and doctored ledgers. On June 25, 2020, exactly 1 week after the banking officer's fateful phone call, Wirecard filed for insolvency, the first member of Germany's prestigious DAX index ever to do so. The missing 1.9 billion euros, nearly a quarter of the firm's balance sheet, was declared officially non-existent. Up to 12 billion euros in market value had been conjured, then vaporized, through what prosecutors later called a culture of deception reaching the highest levels. Marcus Braun was arrested at his home that night. When police scanned his garage, they found a brand new Tesla still wrapped in delivery plastic, a silent tribute to a future that would never arrive. During arraignment, he spoke softly, insisting he, too, was a victim of Marsalek's duplicity. The court denied bail. In Munich cafes, patrons dissected the saga between sips of espresso. How had regulators chased whistleblowers instead of culprits? How had auditors overlooked forged bank statements? How did one of Europe's proudest tech darlings hide a crater in its books for half a decade? The questions lingered like smoke after a candle is blown out. Months later, forensic accountants traced fragments of the missing funds to Macau casinos, Belarusian real estate deals, and cryptocurrency wallets buzzing with silent code. None of it added to 1.9 billion euros. The money, like Marsalek, dissolved into rumor. Yet the story carried an unsettling epilogue. In early 2021, the German government announced sweeping reforms to financial oversight. BaFin gained sharper teeth. Auditors faced stricter rotation rules. But for thousands of retirees who had trusted Wirecard with their nest eggs, the changes offered cold comfort. Their savings now lived only in courtroom exhibits and newspaper archives. In the soft hum of those late-night broadcasts detailing the debacle, listeners heard more than numbers. They heard a cautionary murmur about charisma that blinds, complexity that obscures, and the quiet peril of mistaking rapid growth for solid ground. And somewhere, perhaps on a different continent, the fugitive with the small backpack might have smiled, knowing that the most convincing illusions are stitched together from threads everyone is eager to believe. The blood-drop mirage of Theranos. In the sun-washed corridors of Silicon Valley, where glass towers catch early light like prisms, Elizabeth Holmes wore her black turtleneck like a knight's armor. Investors called her the next Steve Jobs. Journalists photographed her steely gaze, and every panel discussion ended with applause for the woman who promised to revolutionize healthcare. She spoke of ending medical pain. One pinprick, a single droplet of blood, and hundreds of tests would run in minutes. The company's name, Theranos, combined therapy and diagnosis, two halves of a futuristic promise that sounded too elegant to doubt. Behind tinted conference room glass, Holmes paced beside a device no bigger than a toaster, nicknamed Edison. Its sleek white shell gleamed under showroom lights, but employees whispered that the machine rattled like an old refrigerator when no one was watching. Lab technicians, sworn to strict confidentiality agreements, saw crimson dots of blood-clogged capillaries meant for precise optical readings. Error messages flashed, sample reruns piled up like unsent letters. Yet visitors never saw the mess. Their tours took them down a spotless corridor ending at a single locked door. Holmes would pause, tilt her chin toward the mysterious lab, and tell her guests that Edison was humming away, safely behind proprietary walls. They believed her because belief felt like progress. Walgreens executives certainly believed. In 2013, they signed a multi-million-dollar partnership, eager to place miniature Theranos labs inside neighborhood pharmacies across America. Marketing banners soon appeared beside mint green shelves of cough drops, promising affordable tests without needles, appointments, or long waits. Customers arrived curious, rolled up sleeves, and surrendered droplets onto tiny cartridges. The cartridges traveled not into pocket-sized devices but down Interstate 280 to Theranos' secret laboratory in Palo Alto, where conventional Siemens machines, bulky, unglamorous workhorses, performed the real analyses. Engineers diluted samples to stretch each drop. Accuracy buckled under the strain. One balmy afternoon, a young lab employee named Tyler Schultz stared at conflicting thyroid results on his monitor. He reran the same sample on a trusted commercial analyzer. The numbers no longer matched. Schultz confided his worry to a coworker, who warned him to stay quiet. Few did. Emails showed that questioning data often triggered Friday meetings in Holmes's glass-walled office, where dissenters faced stern lectures about mission and loyalty. Some left. Others stayed, convinced that bugs would fade with time. Visionaries, after all, were expected to bend reality. Across the country, veteran reporter John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal caught a whiff of something off. An anonymous tip hinted that Theranos devices rarely worked as advertised. Carreyrou began calling former employees, each conversation opening new cracks. The deeper he dug, the more elaborate the illusions appeared. Lab results quietly voided and reissued, validation studies missing core data, regulators ushered past malfunctioning prototypes and shown pre-selected demonstrations. Still, Holmes's charm endured. She sat on magazine covers, addressed former secretaries of state, and welcomed a retired general to her board. Any whisper of skepticism seemed almost rude in the glow of such optimism. Silicon Valley investors poured in cash at valuations north of $9 billion. They signed non-disclosure agreements so tight that even basic financial statements stayed hidden. Some asked for third-party audits. Most accepted Holmes's mesmeric assurances. She spoke softly, eyes wide, telling a story about her uncle's death from cancer and how no family should suffer waiting for lab results. Her voice held a tremor of personal grief, and audiences nodded, momentarily forgetting that grief does not guarantee invention. In October 2015, the journal finally published Carreeru's expose. Headline: Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. The article triggered avalanches. Holmes went on CNBC before dawn, declaring, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy." But federal inspectors soon arrived unannounced. They inspected temperature logs, calibration sheets, and quality control charts, finding routine failures declared within range. They discovered critical value alerts, flags that a patient's life might hang in the balance, left unresolved in desk drawers. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued a scathing report. Walgreens froze its partnership. Safeway, another early backer, quietly dismantled and used test sites. Patients who had based chemotherapy doses or anticoagulant levels on Theranos results began receiving phone calls urging them to retest at traditional labs. A pregnant Arizona woman learned her blood-type antibodies were misreported. A man monitoring prostate cancer discovered his markers had been wildly understated. Lawsuits followed like echoes. By 2016, the company's gilded headquarters felt cavernous. Holmes's portrait still hung outside the elevator bank, eyes unwavering, but conference rooms emptied as layoffs rolled through. In a final attempt at control, Theranos voided 2 years of blood tests, tens of thousands of results erased from medical history. Regulators banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. She promised an updated device. It never materialized. 3 years later, federal prosecutors charged Holmes and former President Sunny Balwani with wire fraud and conspiracy. Court documents painted a quiet thriller. Text messages about burning this place down, slide decks projecting billion-dollar revenues while internal spreadsheets bled red, carefully choreographed demos that ran on hidden cables linked to full-size analyzers in back rooms. The trial began under bright California skies, jurors ushered past satellite trucks and morning show hosts eager for courtroom sketches of Silicon Valley's fallen star. Holmes took the stand in 2021, voice steady, insisting she believed in her technology's promise. Prosecutors displayed emails showing failed proficiency tests, slides shared with investors that borrowed Pfizer's logo without permission, and spreadsheets forecasting profits from devices that never left engineering bays. The jury convicted her on 4 counts of fraud. Early 2022, she awaited sentencing, ankle monitor blinking softly beneath tailored slacks. In quiet living rooms across America, listeners followed the nightly coverage, hearing a parable about faith without verification. They learned how a single droplet of blood can hold miracles or mirages, and how storytelling, when unmoored from truth, can steer even seasoned minds toward cliffs. Somewhere in the valley, the sleek Edison prototypes rest under muted lab lights, inert as museum pieces, relics of a time when the future seemed only a belief away, and a needle-less vision drew everyone close enough to forget the prick of doubt. The endless returns of Bernie Madoff. Lower Manhattan already felt hushed on that December afternoon in 2008, holiday lights blinking against wind-polished windows, when Bernard Madoff pressed the button for the elevator that would carry him to his penthouse apartment. In his coat pocket lay a handwritten list of debts so extraordinary it looked like fiction. $50 billion owed, $0 left. Moments earlier he had told his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, that his firm's investment advisory business was one big lie. They thought he was joking. One glance at his ashen face ended the illusion. For decades, Madoff had been Wall Street's quiet sage. He avoided television cameras, preferred private clubs, and insisted on modesty even as billions slipped into his fund. Clients heard of him through whispers, country club recommendations, synagogue word of mouth, chance meetings at charity galas. He promised steady returns of 10 to 12%, no matter the weather in the markets. Not spectacular, just comfortingly reliable. The numbers arrived each month on cream-colored statements. Up in good years, up in bad years, a serene diagonal line soothing every anxious heart. Inside the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building on 3rd Avenue, the deception ran on rhythm. The investment advisory unit occupied a sealed-off space, accessible only to a handful of employees who slipped through an unmarked door and rode a private elevator to the 18th. Their outdated IBM printers hummed, spitting out trade confirmations for transactions that had never occurred. Clerks snipped paper into confetti and backdated trades so perfectly that auditors, given only a quick tour once a year, saw nothing but tidy binders and neat desks. Across the corridor at the legitimate side of Madoff's enterprise, the market-making business, traded millions of shares a day, earning respect on the NASDAQ, which he had once chaired. Visitors saw bustling terminals and concluded the advisory arm must draw on the same machinery. They did not know that the split-strike conversion strategy touted in glossy brochures existed nowhere but in Madoff's head. Skeptics surfaced over the years. Analyst Harry Markopoulos sat in his Boston office in 1999 and tried to reverse-engineer Madoff's returns. Within 4 minutes, by his account, he realized they were impossible. He wrote a memo to the Securities and Exchange Commission titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud," attaching equations and probability charts. The document landed on a junior examiner's desk, then slipped into a filing cabinet smothered by larger scandals. Each time Markopoulos rang the SEC, agents thanked him politely and moved on. Meanwhile, feeder funds sprouted across Europe, Luxembourg, Geneva, Madrid, collecting euros from pensioners and universities hungry for American consistency. They couriered money to New York, where Frank Di Pasquale, Madoff's lieutenant, recorded deposits with the casual flick of a pencil. Once a month he typed up trade confirmations showing blue-chip stocks purchased at uncanny lows and sold at convenient highs. If clients requested withdrawals, newer money covered the gap, the very definition of a Ponzi scheme. But most clients rarely withdrew. Trust, it seemed, earned more than any dividend. By 2007, storm clouds gathered. The global financial system trembled, hedge funds shuddered, banks hoarded liquidity. Madoff's investors, nervous like everyone else, asked for redemptions. First tens of millions, then hundreds. He stalled, urged patience, hinted at settlement delays on European stock exchanges. But December arrived with no relief, and requests topped $7 billion, far more than the few hundred million left in his Chase account. So, that bleak Wednesday, Madoff invited his sons to the office. He said he planned to distribute $300 million in staff bonuses 2 months early. The sons balked. Rumor alone could sink them. When they pressed, he sighed and uttered the line they would repeat to the FBI within 24 hours. "It's all just one big lie." That evening, federal agents knocked at the penthouse where Madoff sat wearing loafers and a pale blue shirt. He did not run. He simply opened the door and said, "I know why you're here." News broke before dawn. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Stunned investors huddled in lobbies. Fund managers stared at empty spreadsheets. A French aristocrat who had funneled family wealth into Madoff's care took his own life in his office. Charities discovered their endowments erased. A children's cancer foundation closed within weeks. Even baseball legend Sandy Koufax lost savings, learning the cruel truth under stadium lights that suddenly felt too bright. Investigators peeled back layers like drywall in a condemned house. They found no trading blotters with counterparties, no records at the depository trust company, only columns of fictitious symbols and purchase dates chosen after the fact to yield the smooth line investors adored. Madoff admitted the hoax began in the early 90s, though prosecutors suspected it stretched to the late 80s. It had persisted, he said, because clients wanted consistent gains and he could not disappoint them. The statement landed with a chill. Expectations, once fed, had metastasized into obligation. In March 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 counts of fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He spoke for 10 minutes, voice subdued, describing a scheme deeply sorry and ashamed could not cover. Judge Denny Chin called the crime extraordinarily evil and imposed 150 years. Cameras flashed as marshals led the 71-year-old down a hallway where no elevator waited to whisk him back up. In empty boardrooms from Paris to Palm Beach, shell-shocked trustees reviewed allocation policies, realizing that the promise of safety had blinded them more than any complicated derivative ever could. They saw how an avuncular grin, a whisper of exclusivity, and a line that always pointed upward formed the most potent lure in finance, the myth of certainty. Bernard Madoff died in prison in 2021, the final chapter closed, Yet echoes persist each time a fund manager waves away volatility as if nature herself can be tamed. Late-night listeners, hearing the tale retold on a calm voice over soft static, feel a shiver. Sometimes the smoothest path conceals the sharpest edge, and the man offering an elevator ride to effortless gains may be guiding everyone gently, quietly toward an empty shaft. Enron's phantom profits. The Houston skyline glittered like a circuit board in late 2001, its glass towers humming with oil patch swagger, yet no building shone brighter than Enron's headquarters on Smith Street. Employees called it the mothership, a 40-story monument where elevator doors opened onto trading floors that crackled with energy and easy confidence. Kenneth Lay, the genial founder, liked to stroll the corridors greeting interns by name. Jeffrey Skilling, the hard-charging CO, paced nearby with the quick, clipped steps of a man chasing the future he had already sold to Wall Street. Enron had begun as a conventional pipeline company, but Skilling wanted something sleeker. Energy, he insisted, could be traded like stocks or soybeans, its price unlocked by clever contracts rather than buried pipes. The idea felt radical in the mid-1990s, and traders embraced it like a game. They bought and sold electricity, natural gas, even weather futures, recording profits the moment the deals were signed, years before any cash would arrive. The accounting term was mark-to-market. Inside Enron, it earned a different nickname, mark-to-make-believe. Traders joked that only two skills mattered, persuasion and PowerPoint. A desk might structure a 20-year gas supply contract, assign it a glowing valuation on day one, and ring a brass bell to celebrate an instant windfall. The actual gas might not flow for 12 months, yet the income already shimmered on the spreadsheet. Auditors from Arthur Andersen nodded approval. Complexity often wears the mask of innovation. Each quarter, Skilling swept into investor calls and announced record earnings, his tone so casual it felt impolite to doubt him. Analysts raised their price targets. Fortune magazine named Enron America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. But another rhythm pulsed behind the upbeat numbers. Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow managed a labyrinth of special-purpose entities, partnerships with innocuous names like LJM and Raptors, that sat just off Enron's balance sheet. They bought underperforming assets from Enron at inflated prices, propping up earnings while hiding debt. The partnerships were, in fact, financed by Enron stock itself. As long as the share price climbed, the merry-go-round spun smoothly. Senior executives earned bonuses tied to stock options. Their incentives fused with the illusion. In the summer of 2001, the first tremors arrived. An internal accountant, Sharon Watkins, wrote a memo to Lay warning that Fastow's structures might unravel. "I am incredibly nervous," she typed, the words steady yet urgent. Lay asked law firm Vinson and Elkins to review. Their report concluded the deals were creative but not illegal. No external disclosure followed. Meanwhile, Skilling, citing personal reasons, abruptly resigned on August 14. The move baffled markets. His departure felt like a captain abandoning a ship in calm seas. Calm vanished in October when investigative reporter Bethany McLean published a Fortune piece titled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" She had asked Skilling a simple question months earlier: how exactly does Enron make its money? His answer, "I don't care what you think," now echoed ominously. Analysts, once charmed, began sifting through filings, finding footnotes that read like riddles. Debt seemed to hop between entities, appearing and disappearing with each new 10K. On October 16, Enron issued third-quarter results that included a $1.2 billion equity reduction linked to Fastow's partnerships. The announcement landed like a dropped glass. Credit rating agencies downgraded Enron to near junk. Counterparties demanded more collateral. Traders who once joked about energy derivatives now refused to answer Enron's calls. Liquidity evaporated in hours, as if someone had twisted shut every valve in Texas. Fastow tried to reassure banks with late-night slides, flipping pages while sweat beaded on his collar. But confidence, once punctured, leaks fast. By November 8, the company restated earnings back to 1997, erasing $586 million in profit. Employees watching the news in the cafeteria heard the numbers and felt something inside tilt. Many had plowed retirement savings into Enron stock, encouraged by memos praising shared destiny. The stock closed at less than $1 on November 28. Thanksgiving weekend brought no relief. Lay huddled with advisors in his River Oaks mansion, phoning Treasury officials, pleading for a rescue that never came. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at the time. Hours later, thousands of workers were told to clear their desks, their pensions suddenly worth pennies. Security guards escorted them past a lobby still displaying a neon sign that glowed crimson. Enron, ask why. Investigators swarmed. The more they dug, the more the empire resembled a stage set. One asset proudly touted to investors, a Nigerian barge project, turned out to be a vessel parked on a riverbank, its sale, a round-trip deal designed only to book revenue. Broadband, a hyped video-on-demand unit, never left beta testing, yet generated hundreds of millions in projected profit on day one thanks to mark-to-market enchantment. Fasto had pocketed tens of millions in fees from his own partnerships. Arthur Andersen, torn between client loyalty and legal duty, shredded truckloads of audit papers before regulators arrived. The firm itself dissolved months later, its name forever tied to the scandal. Trials unfolded like serialized drama. Fasto pleaded guilty and testified against his former colleagues. Skilling maintained that complex did not equal fraudulent. He had believed, he said, in the numbers. Jurors disagreed, convicting him on 19 counts. Lay, awaiting sentencing, died of a heart attack in Colorado. Some former employees said justice felt cheated. Skilling received 24 years, later reduced. Emerging 2 decades older, the energy world utterly changed. Yet the most haunting image lingered outside the Houston office shortly after the collapse. A lone employee wheeling a box of family photos past a dumpster overflowing with blue Enron binders, their mission statements fluttering in the breeze. She paused, glanced up at the gleaming tower, and walked on. For listeners today, the Enron saga drifts through late-night speakers like a cautionary lullaby. It reminds them that numbers can sing any tune when recorded in the key of ambition, that innovation without transparency curdles into spectacle, and that a company hailed as the future of energy can vanish quicker than a light bulb flicked off at dusk. In the hushed dark, the tower's neon once urged everyone to ask why. The real warning may be simpler. When profits appear too smooth and explanations too vague, asking why is only the beginning. The clean diesel smoke screen. Wolfsburg in early autumn feels orderly, almost ceremonial. The town squares are lined with red brick, the factory chimneys rise like metronomes, and in 2014 Volkswagen's headquarters pulsed with the certainty of a company that had just overtaken Toyota as the world's largest automaker. Inside Building 90, executives rehearsed talking points about Das Auto finally conquering America. Their ace was clean diesel, engines said to deliver torque, thrift, and near-pristine emissions. California regulators, famously strict, had already certified the cars. Billboards on Interstate 5 showed smiling families cruising beneath captions that read "No compromise." Yet in a laboratory 2 miles from the Pacific, a graduate student named John German noticed something odd. He worked with the International Council on Clean Transportation, a small nonprofit that rented time at West Virginia University's emissions lab. German's team was running on-road tests of 3 diesel models, a BMW, a VW Jetta, and a VW Passat. The BMW behaved as advertised, but the Volkswagen spewed nitrogen oxides at levels up to 40 times the legal limit, only when driven outside a stationary lab. Plugged into a treadmill-like dynamometer, the same cars reverted to angelic readings. The contradiction felt like a joke with no punchline. German filed a polite report, expecting VW engineers to blame a software hiccup. Instead, Wolfsburg offered silence, then deflection. "Real-world conditions vary," wrote one spokesperson, a phrase as smooth as the company's brushed steel logo. California's Air Resources Board, CARB, requested fresh data. VW delivered spreadsheets dense with abbreviations but thin on candor. Each follow-up question met the same friendly fog. Across the Atlantic, software developer Peter Mock downloaded the ICCT paper on a rainy Hamburg evening. He had spent years advocating diesel as Europe's bridge to a greener future. The numbers rattled him. Under pouring streetlight, he drafted an email to CARB, urging them not to drop the matter. The exchange would later form a breadcrumb trail for investigators. By spring 2015, pressure clogged conference rooms in VW's engineering wing. Emails surfaced of powertrain manager Oliver Schmidt warning that U.S. regulators had detailed test data. Above him, senior engineers whispered about acoustic functions, a euphemism for lines of code that sensed steering angle, barometric pressure, and wheel rotation. When those variables matched the gentle monotony of a lab test, the software flipped to dyno mode, dialing back pollutants. Out on real roads, the secret switch turned off, freeing engines to deliver sportier acceleration, along with invisible toxins. The cheat had begun nearly a decade earlier. Engineers faced an impossible triangle: American emission limits tightening, marketing demanding fuel economy, and budgets shrinking. One late-night meeting ended with a quiet consensus. If physics refused to bend, software would. A programmer dubbed the solution der Skammelmodus, the cheating mode, and tucked it into the engine control unit like a stowaway. German authorities had no reason to suspect deception. European lab tests were predictable and rarely audited on highways. The deception might have endured had CARB not insisted that VW certify 2016 models with fresh data. Facing a registration freeze, executives flew to Sacramento in August 2015 and finally conceded. 11 million cars worldwide carried the hidden code. An internal slide deck labeled the event, the disclosure. Publicly, CEO Martin Winterkorn waited 4 more weeks before stepping in front of cameras. He wore a charcoal suit, the knot of his tie so tight it looked painful. He admitted irregularities, a word that sounded almost tidy, then apologized to our customers, to authorities, and to the public. Shares fell 30% in 2 days, vaporizing $26 billion in market value. Workers at the Wolfsburg plant watched the ticker slump on cafeteria televisions, their famed job security suddenly fragile. Investigators from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency arrived unannounced at VW's testing centers. They found binders labeled cycle beating, PowerPoint slides depicting graphs of emissions plotted against mode triggers, and memos warning of criminal liability if documents were deleted. In one email, an engineer joked about adjusting software to pass our beloved dynamometers, gallows humor scribbled in pixels. As winter settled, the scandal fanned outward. Audi and Porsche diesels were pulled into the storm, then other manufacturers faced probing questions. European cities that had encouraged diesel now weighed driving bans. Parents in Stuttgart wondered whether the morning haze over schoolyards carried more poison than fog. In January 2017, the U.S. Department of Justice announced felony charges against 6 VW executives. Oliver Schmidt, arrested during a vacation layover in Miami, stared at airport officers who recognized him from a sealed warrant. He would later receive 7 years in federal prison. Winterkorn, sheltered in Germany, faced indictment in absentia and resigned his honorary professorships. The company itself pled guilty to fraud and obstruction, agreeing to pay $30 billion in fines and buybacks, enough to line U.S. interstates with a ribbon of repurchased cars stretching from Seattle to Savannah. The human toll emerged in quieter anecdotes. A West Virginia researcher questioning his life's work, a factory line worker in Chattanooga laid off as production halted, families trading in their beloved TDI wagons for hybrids that felt uninspiringly honest. Meanwhile, climate scientists calculated that the excess nitrogen oxides might have caused scores of premature deaths across Europe, casualties without faces. Volkswagen vowed redemption. Board members approved an electric vehicle pivot dubbed Roadmap E. Engineers scrubbed assembly lines, replacing diesel injectors with battery packs. Yet during earnings calls, analysts still asked the same hushed question. How did a culture proud of precision become fluent in deceit? Some pointed to relentless targets. 12% U.S. market share by 2018 had hung on office walls like scripture. Others blamed hierarchical silence. Junior developers who questioned the cheat were told the discussion was above pay grade. Today, late-night listeners hearing the soft recounting of Dieselgate envision millions of cars gliding down moonlit autobahns, exhaust invisible but data unmistakable. They hear how a line of code, written to solve an engineering dilemma, grew into a corporate tumor that nearly consumed Germany's industrial crown jewel. And they grasp the final irony. The company that once sold silence beneath a slogan of cleanliness now funds loud, colorful ads touting a fully electric future. A penance paid in kilowatts and contrition. Somewhere between those billboards and the quiet laboratories where it all began, the lesson idles like an engine at a red light. Shortcuts taken in the dark will always stall in the daylight. The rogue on the Singapore floor. The morning sun slid through the plate glass windows of the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, casting pale stripes across rows of traders clad in bright cotton jackets. Amid the shouts and flashing hand signals, one figure moved with choreographed certainty. Nick Leeson, 27, Barings Bank's rising star. Head of both the front office and the back office for Barings Futures Singapore, he could price a Nikkei 225 option and moments later reconcile the paperwork himself, an arrangement that seemed efficient until the day it wasn't. London regarded Leeson as a prodigy. In weekly faxes he delivered profits so smooth they looked machine-knitted, a steady climb of 7-figure gains, month after month, unmarred by volatility. Executives on Bishopsgate, eager to revive the city's oldest merchant bank, saw him as proof that a 233-year-old institution could dance in modern derivatives without missing a beat. Bonuses flowed, compliance questions did not. 2 floors beneath the trading pit, a mainframe terminal blinked with an entry code few in London recognized, 88888. On their screens the account appeared innocuous, tucked under error, a temporary parking bay for small mismatches. For Leeson it became a hidden attic. Losses, beginning as tiny dents, were swept there each evening before reports left for England. Whenever markets turned against him, he doubled down, convinced that tomorrow's rally would erase yesterday's red. January 17, 1995, should have been just another doubling. At 5:46 a.m. local time, the Great Hanshin earthquake ripped through Kobe, Japan, toppling highways and lives alike. The Nikkei plunged, and with it the futures contracts Leeson had leveraged beyond anyone's imagination. That night he sat alone in his apartment, balcony door ajar, listening to scooter engines in the humid dark while the deficit in 88888 widened to £50 million, then £100 million, a sum larger than Baring's entire trading capital. Still he believed a rebound was imminent. To fund ever larger wagers he cabled London for cash, framing each request as margin to arbitrage harmless price gaps. Risk managers, lulled by his historic profits, wired the funds, noting vaguely that Far East volumes were expanding. In the city's mahogany-paneled boardrooms, directors toasted record growth. Only one junior auditor raised concern over the opaque error account. His memo stalled beneath layers of hierarchy and holiday schedules. Through February the Nikkei refused to cooperate. Each slide multiplied Leeson's margin calls. He issued a now infamous instruction, DRINKMORECOKE, spelled out in blue and yellow pennants on the trading floor, an inside joke urging colleagues to stay caffeinated for an all-night push. The euphoric mood masked dread. By mid-month the secret deficit neared £500 million. In a final, panicked gambit, Leeson bought tens of thousands of futures contracts betting the index would rise before March. He signed the tickets himself, filled in the clearing slips in the same looping hand, and dropped them into the evening pouch bound for London. His last act before dawn was to scrawl a short note to his bosses, "Heavy weather today." The weather grew catastrophic. Tokyo opened weaker, then weaker still. Around 10 p.m. Singapore time on February 23, Leeson left his desk, walked through the neon-lit corridors of Changi Airport, and boarded a flight to Kuala Lumpur. On the seat beside him lay a letter addressed to Baring's chairman. "I'm sorry. There is no money left." London awoke to a storm with no eye. Phone lines jammed as managers pieced together the truth. The error account held a loss of £827 million, twice the bank's capital. Clerks paged through stacks of confirmation slips, each stamped with Leeson's initials. The old merchant house that had financed the Louisiana Purchase, backed Queen Victoria's railways, and boasted the Prince of Wales as a client now stared at irrevocable insolvency. Sunday, February 26, at 7 p.m., Baring's filed for administration. Television crews gathered outside its wrought iron entrance, broadcasting images of employees carrying bankers' boxes under a grey London drizzle. Some clutched family photos, others simply kept walking, stunned that a single trader in a distant time zone had killed a national icon. Regulators traced the anatomy of the collapse with clinical precision. They found that Leeson's dual role let him trade and settle his own books, Fox and Henhouse in one tidy salary. They noted how daily profit emails from Singapore bypassed value-at-risk models, landing directly on the chairman's desk, where good news rarely invites skepticism. They discovered handwritten changes on risk reports, faxes lost in transit, and a culture that equated questioning success with poor team spirit. Leeson was arrested in Frankfurt, extradited to Singapore, and sentenced to 6.5 years. During trial he described a treadmill that accelerated each time he stumbled. "I wanted to win it back, every single day." Baring's remnants were sold for £1 to ING, the Dutch bank that absorbed both assets and reputation in one gulp. Today, late-night listeners hearing the saga drift from bedside speakers picture the glowing digits of 88,888, pulsing like a forbidden heart inside a steel computer cabinet. They sense the seduction of unchecked autonomy, the peril in applauding profits drawn with invisible ink, and the speed with which a centuries-old institution can vanish between market close and market open. Somewhere, perhaps in another trading room, the screens still flicker, and the temptation to hide a small loss for just one more day remains, waiting like a rogue trade for the next confident hand to type the first keystroke. the hollow lines of WorldCom. When dusk settled over Clinton, Mississippi, the sodium lamps outside WorldCom's campus glowed like watchful sentries. Inside Building E, a vast open floor hummed with the dial tone static of long-distance switches and the gentle clatter of keyboards. Scott Sullivan, the revered chief financial officer, liked to walk those aisles after most employees had gone home, jacket folded over one arm, eyes skimming the flat panel monitors that mapped voice traffic in flickering green. He could read those screens as a cardiologist reads an EKG. Every pulse of data told him whether WorldCom's heart was still beating fast enough to please Wall Street. Bernard Ebbers, the company's lanky, silver-haired chief executive, had promised dizzying growth ever since he'd stitched together dozens of small telephone carriers into a single empire. His legend was irresistible, a former basketball coach turned motel owner who'd leapt into telecom just as the internet arrived. Reporters loved the cowboy boots he wore to shareholder meetings, the earnest twang with which he declared that bandwidth demand would double every 100 days. "Stay with us and we'll wire the world," he'd say, and analysts would raise their price targets another notch. But by 2000, the easy expansion was over. The dot-com boom sagged, and companies that once bought circuits by the mile suddenly canceled orders. Every lost customer left behind the same bruise in the ledger. Fixed network costs unmoved, revenues sagging. Sullivan watched the operating margin slide toward zero. Quarterly guidance loomed like a cliff. Late one evening he gathered a handful of senior accountants in a glass-walled conference room. A whiteboard stood between them and the darkened hallway beyond. On it Sullivan drew a block diagram. Revenue on top, line cost expenses beneath. As he talked, he uncapped a red pen and almost casually shifted $771 million in line costs, fees WorldCom paid to lease other carriers' networks, into a capital expenditure bucket labeled prepaid capacity. The move turned expenses into assets as if by magic. A simple journal entry would lift earnings, keep ratios bright, and he assured them, would be temporary until demand rebounds. The accountant stared at the number as though it were a live wire. Capitalizing operating costs violated basic accounting scripture, but Sullivan's authority felt unassailable. He cited statement of position 98-1, a rule about software development costs. The comparison was stretched thin, yet the veneer of jargon provided cover. By midnight the first adjusting entries were keyed into the general ledger, buried in an account code no outsider had reason to scrutinize. From that night forward the pattern hardened into ritual. Each quarter a spreadsheet labeled topside entries circulated between Sullivan's office and the tiny controller's cubicle bank. The document listed precise figures, $560 million here, $743 million there, each routed to obscure capital accounts titled Fiber Route Development or Corporate Consolidation. The numbers lengthened like shadows at sundown, eventually totaling more than $3.8 billion. WorldCom's earnings announcements resumed their old, comforting cadence. Ebbers strode onto conference calls brimming with folksy triumph. Revenue up, costs controlled, synergy ahead of schedule. His baritone carried no tremor, even as the real cash balance told a harsher story. Brokerage analysts, lulled by those tidy lines, penciled in by recommendations. Pension funds poured in retirees' savings. On Main Street, small investors dialed up discount brokers and bought shares at $40, $50, $60, certain they were catching the next AT&T before it bloomed. Yet within the warren of cubicles on the 5th floor, whispers gathered. Betty Vinson, a middle-aged accounting manager known for meticulous binders, confessed to a colleague that she felt sick every time she entered another phony capitalization. She drafted a resignation letter, then tore it up after Sullivan assured her the adjustments would soon be reversed. The promise felt hollow, but in a town where WorldCom badges opened doors to schools, hospitals, and country clubs, quitting carried its own dread. The facade cracked in March 2002 when Cynthia Cooper, Vice President of Internal Audit, learned that capital expenditure accounts were ballooning without corresponding network builds. Cooper was methodical. She formed a small, secret team that conducted after-hours reviews, laptops balanced on knees to avoid the clack of desktop keyboards alerting IT logs. They traced ledger entries line by line, watching expenses leapfrog into asset pools like chess pieces moving 2 squares at once. Cooper's team met resistance at every turn. Requests for invoices stalled in bureaucracy. Server access was revoked for maintenance. One night, rummaging through storage, they found a stack of unsigned capital release forms. Evidence that numbers had been shifted without the engineering department's knowledge. The more obstacles they faced, the clearer the picture became. The company's margins were not engineered by efficiency but by eraser dust. On June 14, Cooper delivered her findings to the audit committee. The presentation lasted only 20 minutes, yet silence afterward stretched longer. Board members glanced at each other as though waiting for someone to declare it was all a misunderstanding. None did. They summoned Sullivan, who arrived with the measured calm of a seasoned negotiator, but his slides could not unknot the absurdity of classifying routine phone line fees as multimillion-dollar investments. Under gentle but relentless questioning, his narrative frayed. 6 days later, Sullivan was fired. Ebers, still clinging to the story that demand would return, phoned influential investors begging for patience. The SEC instead demanded restatements. On July 21, 2002, WorldCom filed for bankruptcy protection, its debts towering at $41 billion, the largest corporate failure America had ever recorded. Employees learned the news while passing between cubicles, radios whispering headlines that sounded surreal in the fluorescent hush. Court documents soon revealed how a simple accounting entry, repeated and multiplied, could mimic profitability with chilling precision. The scheme required no offshore shell companies, no encrypted bank wires, only the pliability of numbers under a confident hand. Ebers was convicted of fraud and conspiracy, receiving a 25-year sentence. Sullivan, after cooperating, received 5. Vinson wept at her own sentencing, spared prison but branded with a felony that followed her like a shadow on bright pavement. Years later, abandoned WorldCom fiber ducts still run beneath American highways, dark strands that once promised limitless capacity. Late-night listeners hearing this tale may picture those hollow conduits and the equally hollow spreadsheet rows that fed them. They learned that sometimes fraud is not a daring heist but a quiet, incremental slide. A reclassification here, a deferred expense there, until the truth gapes open like a sinkhole beneath the very roads the cables were meant to serve. And in that stillness they sense a lingering echo, the danger of believing any line, however neat, when it glides upward without ever bending to reality. The tilted clock of Libor. London wakes slowly in December, its river catching pale sunlight like a ribbon of mercury. On the 9th floor of a glass tower in Canary Wharf, a trader named Tom Hayes is already perched at his desk, headphones sealed to his ears, eyes locked on twin screens where numbers flicker in fractions of a second. He deals in interest rate derivatives, esoteric contracts that pivot on a single benchmark, the London Interbank Offered Rate, better known as Libor. That rate is, quite literally, the price of money for banks across the world, set each morning at 11 o'clock by a panel of elite institutions. A wobble of 1/100 of a percentage point can shift millions. Hayes is a gifted mathematician, restless and pale, with a habit of rocking gently when markets grow tense. His employer, first UBS and later Citigroup, admires his uncanny ability to squeeze profit from barely visible movements in Libor. What few executives notice, or choose not to notice, is how eagerly Hayes talks with other bank submitters, men and women who send in that crucial daily estimate. He messages them in a shorthand that feels playful. "Bro, any chance of 3M Libor a smidge lower tomorrow? We'll owe you a steak." The tone is breezy, the stakes astronomical. The mechanism itself seems quaint in a city wired for fiber optic speed. Each weekday a handful of banks tell the British Bankers Association the rate at which they think they could borrow unsecured money. The highest and lowest quartiles are trimmed away, the remainder averaged, and by lunchtime the figure pours into contracts that underpin everything from adjustable rate mortgages in Ohio to student loans in Milan. Yet no regulator checks the numbers. They rest on professional honor, a commodity rarer than gold when bonuses hinge on the tiniest edge. Back in 2007 the global credit markets are rattling. Trust between banks thins to tissue. If a firm submits a Libor estimate that looks too high, traders and journalists might guess it's desperate for cash. Reputation, therefore, becomes one more variable to manage. Bank A nudges its rate down to project strength. Bank B follows suit not to stand out. Into this fog steps Hayes, who sees an opportunity so elegant it feels almost victimless. Coordinates submissions just enough to shift the average in favor of his book. Coordination begins with courtesy. "Need high 1M fix, mate?" he types to a former colleague now at Royal Bank of Scotland. The colleague replies with a winking emoticon, "Consider it done." Minutes later Hayes adjusts positions worth hundreds of millions, certain the fix will arrive as promised. Most days it does. When it doesn't, he fires off a mild rebuke, never angry, always transactional, then resumes the gentle rocking that suits him between prints. At first, compliance departments view Libor as distant noise. Their focus lies on blockbuster scandals, Rogue trades, insider tips, suspicious cash wires. Hayes's chats seem almost collegial. Some supervisors even encourage the relationship management, reminding traders to keep the wheel greased. After all, the bank's own treasury desk also wants predictable funding costs. A skewed LIBOR can brighten quarterly earnings, and bright earnings keep shareholders docile. By 2010, however, the chatter has multiplied beyond backslapping jokes. Regulators in Washington and London receive anonymous emails hinting at systemic meddling. One note reads, "Check the timestamps on rate submissions versus swap desk positions. Patterns too clean to be random." The Financial Services Authority begins a quiet scrape of Bloomberg logs, flagging entries where spikes in profit coincide with uncharacteristic shifts in the fix. An internal auditor at UBS, combing through stored chats to satisfy a routine request, stumbles upon Hayes's stake for a rate messages. Her first reaction is disbelief. The language is so casual she assumes it must be industry slang for something innocuous. 2 days later she escalates the file. Senior counsel schemes pages of conversations ending in smiley faces and free lunch promises, their simplicity masking a conspiracy that may have tipped trillions of dollars in contracts. In December 2012, the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the UK Financial Services Authority announced parallel findings. Multiple banks, including UBS, Barclays, and RBS, manipulated LIBOR for years. The fines total more than $2.5 billion. Reading the press release, Hayes feels the floor tilt. He is not arrested yet, but the perimeter closes. Citigroup dismisses him within a week. Security escorts him through the lobby where a Christmas tree twinkles behind plate glass. Prosecutors need a human face for an abstraction that spans continents. Hayes, meticulous and unguarded in his chats, presents a perfect storyboard. In 2015, he stands trial at Southwark Crown Court, the first individual charged in the scandal. Jurors watch projected transcripts, colorful, sometimes juvenile, occasionally desperate. One says simply, "Please low 6M fix, my P&L is bleeding." The defense argues that everyone did it, that managers winked approval. The prosecution counters that office culture may explain misconduct but cannot excuse it. After 9 weeks, Hayes is convicted on 8 counts of conspiracy to defraud. The judge calls the offense a disease that infected every corner of the financial world, sentencing him to 14 years, later reduced on appeal. Hayes, diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, tells reporters outside court that he never believed he was cheating anyone. It was a game with no rules. His words hang in the damp London air, unsettling because they sound partly true. Reforms arrive. The Intercontinental Exchange takes over LIBOR administration. Submission rules tighten, criminal liability sharpens. Still, the benchmark survives, patched, scrutinized, yet central to daily finance. Only in 2021 do authorities announce its full retirement, a belated admission that trust once fractured may never be fully mended. For late-night listeners, the tale unspools like a parable about invisible levers. They learn that global rates rested not on ironclad math but on a daily pole, as pliable as wet clay in the hands of traders trading favors. They picture a young mathematician rocking in his chair while numbers dance to whispered cues, and they sense the broader chill. When time itself, the cost of borrowing across tomorrow, next month, next decade, can be nudged by quiet texts and promised stakes, vigilance must stretch beyond algorithms to the oldest safeguard of all, the unglamorous insistence on honest answers at 11 a.m. each day. The sour milk of Parmalat. Even in winter, Parma smells faintly of butter and warm dough, a quiet perfume rising from family bakeries that line the narrow streets. On Via Emilia Ovest, however, the air once carried a sharper scent, ozone from humming bottling lines inside Parmalat's sprawling headquarters. Employees joked that the plant's white facade looked like a milk carton tipped on its side. In the late 1990s, that carton seemed big enough to hold half of Italy's economic dreams. At the top sat Callisto Tanzi, founder and patriarch, his round spectacles reflecting confidence that tasted as sweet as the company's chocolate UHT milk. Tanzi's rise bordered on folklore. In 1961, he inherited his father's failing delicatessen and replaced cured meats with a single pasteurization machine. By the 1980s, Parmalat trademarks glowed on supermarket shelves from Milan to Madrid, packaged as long-life milk that required no refrigeration, science packaged as convenience. Television ads showed athletes sprinting across beaches, cartons held high like torches. Italians, long suspicious of anything not fresh from the farm, embraced the promise of safety, speed, and modernity. Growth brought applause, but it also brought hunger. Tanzi wanted sports teams, television networks, even tourism resorts. Ventures that drank cash faster than a bottling line could earn it. Banks initially obliged, partly because Parmalat's balance sheet sparkled with liquidity. Billions in short-term investments parked, so auditors believed, in a Cayman Islands subsidiary called Bonlat. Each December, when Deloitte's Italian arm asked for proof, Parma faxed over letters on Bank of America stationery confirming deposits of €3.95 billion. The signatures looked crisp, the routing numbers plausible. No one dialed the Cayman branch to double-check. Phones tend to stay silent when paperwork appears immaculate. Inside Parmalat's finance office, a quieter rhythm pulsed. Chief Financial Officer Fausto Tana orchestrated it, a conductor of looping loans and paper profits. When a bond matured, he raised a larger one through a Dutch shell company, funneled it through Luxembourg partnerships, then recorded the incoming cash as revenue from strategic investments. Outflows vanished into a single opaque line item, other assets, that grew like a snowdrift. Analysts who noticed the ballooning category shrugged. Italian conglomerates, they said, were famously labyrinthine. But by 2002, credit markets tightened. Interest payments on Parmalat's €7 billion debt gobbled nearly every euro of true operating income. Tana devised what he called the titanium deal, a bond issued through a Delaware vehicle whose prospectus ran 300 pages yet failed to mention that Parmalat itself was secretly buying most of the bond with borrowed money. The maneuver covered a funding gap but left the company essentially lending to itself at investor expense. Tanzi signed off, trusting Tana's assurance that the circle would remain unbroken. Trouble arrived on a cool September morning in 2003, disguised as a fax machine jam at Merrill Lynch's Milan office. A junior analyst, reviewing Parmalat's latest bond offering, could not reconcile the cash figures with public filings. The analyst's manager called a friend at Bank of America in North Carolina, casually asking about Bonlat's multi-billion euro account. The banker rustled papers, tapped a keyboard, then replied, "We show no record of that entity banking with us." The words thudded like a dropped crate. Within days, Bank of America issued a formal letter. The Cayman deposit certificates were forgeries. Parmalat stock, already wobbling, plunged 40% before trading was halted. Italian regulators raided headquarters, seizing ledgers thick with handwritten amendments. One entry described a €200 million sale of powdered milk to Cuba. Investigators later learned the island had received only a fraction of that quantity, paid partly in rum and cigars. The bulk of the receivable was air. As panic spread, Tanzi boarded a Meridiana flight from Parma to Rome, where he met frantic lawyers in a hotel suite overlooking the Tiber. Newspapers would soon dub that night La Lunga Notte del Latte, the long night of milk. Advisors urged a swift confession. Without it, prosecutors might freeze family assets, including Tanzi's beloved Parma Football Club. Near dawn he agreed, signing a statement that acknowledged certain irregular accounting practices. The phrase felt tiny beside the €14 billion hole auditors now estimated. On December 24, 2003, Christmas Eve, Italian police arrested Tanzi at his villa. Television crews filmed officers escorting him past a nativity scene still lit in the courtyard, a tableau that made even seasoned reporters swallow hard. Inside the fridge, investigators found rows of Parmalat yogurts neatly aligned, expiration dates still months away, an ordinary detail suddenly eerie. In court, Tanzi spoke softly, almost apologetically, claiming he had diverted roughly €500 million to prop up his football team, never imagining the gesture would snowball. Prosecutors countered with stark math. Forged bank letters, sham transactions with Venezuelan dairies that existed only on letterhead, and board minutes rewritten after meetings to mask dissent. Tana turned state witness, sketching flowcharts that tangled across courtroom easels. Each arrow ended in the same conclusion. Money in circles, profits in press releases, nothing in the bank. By 2005, Tanzi was sentenced to 10 years for market manipulation and later received additional terms totaling nearly 2 decades. Deloitte's Italian partner lost its license for failing to confirm the Cayman accounts. Thousands of small investors, many from Emilia-Romagna farming cooperatives that once supplied Parmalat with raw milk, saw pension savings evaporate. They gathered in town halls clutching blue and white share certificates, pieces of paper every bit as worthless as the Cayman bank letters. Parmalat, astonishingly, survived. Under new management and strict oversight, it trimmed debts, shed the soccer team, and returned to profit, eventually joining the French giant Lactalis. Yet even today, truck drivers arriving at the Parma plant pause beneath the gate's familiar logo, an 8-petal flower. wondering how something that looked so wholesome could have hidden such decay. Late-night listeners hearing this story breathe in the faint imaginary aroma of warm milk and pastry, then exhale a reminder. Trust, like dairy, spoils when left unchilled. A forged signature, a fictional island deposit, a looping loan, each seemed small enough to overlook, until suddenly they curdled together into the largest bankruptcy Europe had ever tasted. In the quiet that follows, the carton-shaped building on Via Emilia Ovis stands ghost-white against the stars, a monument to ambition soured by its own excess. The shadow ledgers of Munich. A soft Bavarian dusk settled over Munich when the first whispers drifted across the trading desks. Wirecard's quarterly numbers were off, far off. To the casual shareholder, the digital payments darling still gleamed, its stock chart a staircase pointing ever upward. Yet in the hushed corners of the firm's own headquarters, a different narrative pressed against the silence. It began with an unremarkable email that landed on the desk of a junior auditor named Lena Vogel, the sort of message that should have been routine, an automated alert about a small reconciliation mismatch at a third-party payment processor in the Philippines. Lena, precise by nature, double-checked the figures. The shortfall, only a few €1,000, felt trivial. Still, she flagged it to her supervisor, Mark Brewer, who preferred to smooth wrinkles quickly. Round-off noise, he called it. But something in the data gnawed at Lena, tiny anomalies scattered like breadcrumbs across distant servers. Duplicate vendor IDs, payments looping through sleeper accounts, revenue lines sprouting without invoices. The following week, a second alert arrived, this time from Singapore. Again, the discrepancy was marginal, but the pattern whispered of something larger buried beneath layers of shell companies. Lena asked for a full list of Wirecard's offshore acquiring partners. The file she received was immaculate, too immaculate. Dozens of entities, stamped with certification dates, tax numbers, and digital signatures, gleamed like polished brass. She noticed, however, that several addresses resolved to co-working spaces rented by the day. That same evening, while Munich's beer halls pulsed with summer tourists, Lena sat in her apartment scouring corporate registries. A Philippine company named Osint Global, credited with millions in annual profit, shared a phone number with a laundry service in Manila. Another, Alhai Payments in Dubai, appeared on no local business database at all. She typed until dawn, her screen haloing the room in a cold glow. Inside Wirecard, the mood remained buoyant. Executive briefings extolled explosive growth in Asia, conjuring visions of card swipes under neon city lights. Employees toasted quarterly targets with Prosecco in the cafeteria. Chief Executive Marcus Braun strode the marble lobby with evangelical confidence, calling skeptics enemies of innovation. Press releases spoke of vaults of cash parked safely in trustee accounts across the globe. When Lena presented her findings to Mark, he frowned, eyes darting toward a closed meeting room. Compliance has already signed off, he insisted, adjusting his tie. You're seeing ghosts. He suggested a long weekend and slid a voucher for an upscale spa across the desk. Lena declined. She had begun to sense the machinery of obfuscation, gears meshing behind every polite smile. 2 months later, the Financial Times published an explosive piece. Anonymous whistleblowers alleged that Wirecard was inflating revenue through a web of third-party acquiring partners. The newsroom's phones rang non-stop. Hedge funds smelled smoke. Wirecard's share price dipped, then recovered after a fiery rebuttal from Braun, who labeled the article fake news. Internal emails urged employees to stand proud, reminding them that market visionaries were always misunderstood. But auditors from KPMG were now under contract for an independent review. Lena, sidelined from key meetings, watched teams wheel boxes of files into sealed conference rooms. She knew the incriminating documents would not be found on company servers. They resided in what colleagues half-jokingly called the shadow ledgers, spreadsheets emailed between trusted insiders before being wiped. Access was limited, and Lena no longer received the late-night pings she once did. Frustrated, she reached out to a former co-worker now in Singapore, Ravi Sharma, who had managed merchant onboarding for Southeast Asia. Over an encrypted call, Ravi confessed that many supposed clients were phantom shops. Websites never went live, addresses belonged to P.O. boxes, and yet monthly statements showed roaring sales. Money sluiced from one offshore node to another before looping back as legitimate revenue. It's like watching water poured into a Mobius strip, he whispered. The KPMG report, delayed for months, finally surfaced in April. Its language was cautious, but the subtext screamed. Crucial data was missing, access obstructed, explanations inconsistent. The board summoned an emergency call as investors dumped shares in a panic. On a sweltering June morning, auditors asked a simple question. Could Wirecard confirm the existence of €1.9 billion supposedly held in two Philippine banks? A pause stretched across continents. Then came the brittle reply: the cash was gone. Perhaps it had never existed. Police cars rolled up to Wirecard's glass fortress at dawn, lights strobing against steel and stone. Employees huddled behind windows as officers led the company's chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, out the front door. By nightfall he had vanished, slipping beyond border controls with a passport from a friendly nation. Rumors placed him in Belarus, then Moscow, then North Africa, his trail dissolving like mist. Marcus Braun surrendered to authorities, though he maintained that he, too, had been deceived. Shareholders filed suits. Retirees saw pensions evaporate. In Lena's now quiet office, cleaning crews boxed documents under the watchful eye of forensic accountants. She stood by the window one last time, gazing at the Isar River glinting beneath the city's bridges. She felt no triumph, only the hollow echo of potential squandered. Months later, the narrative settled into public memory, a fintech miracle revealed as Europe's largest post-war fraud. Yet the smaller moments remained unseen. The reflexive dismissal of an email, the cover story accepted without question, the spa voucher offered like a hush-money lullaby. Fraud, Lena reflected, was rarely a single dramatic leap. It thrived in incremental concessions in the quiet spaces where doubt was discouraged. As autumn leaves swirled across Munich's avenues, regulators vowed stricter oversight, and tech dreamers drafted new mission statements heavy with promises of transparency. But in unseen rooms across the continent, fresh schemes were already germinating, nourished by ambition and the certainty that someone else would mind the details. And somewhere far away, perhaps under a different sky, a man called Marsalek contemplated his next disguise, confident that shadows still offered ample room to maneuver. The missing billions of Wirecard. For years, the Munich skyline took quiet pride in the silver letters atop a glass tower just off Einstein Ring. Wirecard, the plucky German upstart that had leapt from scrappy payments processor to glittering fintech champion, seemed to embody Europe's digital future. Analysts praised its visionary CEO Marcus Braun, a soft-spoken Austrian with frameless glasses and a monkish fondness for black turtlenecks. Politicians welcomed him as proof that Silicon Valley no longer held a monopoly on innovation. By 2018, Wirecard was worth more than Deutsche Bank, and Braun declared the company would soon handle payments for every second internet user on the planet. Yet beneath the spotless foyer and the gentle hum of elevators, something was off. Employees whispered that senior managers treated simple questions. How exactly does the Manila office generate such margins? Why are audits always delayed? As personal insults, requests for basic data were rerouted through layers of lawyers. And the CFO, a meticulous Swiss accountant, resigned after only 8 months, citing personal reasons and declining all interviews. The first public tremor arrived one cool April morning in 2015, when a short article appeared on a small circulation blog run by an anonymous London analyst. It alleged that Wirecard's explosive profits in Asia came from round-tripped cash, money shuffled from one subsidiary to another in circles fast enough to blur the trail. Wirecard dismissed the post as nonsense written by market manipulators. Its share price dipped, then rebounded to fresh highs. But curiosity is stubborn. At the Financial Times, reporter Dan McCrum filed the blog into a growing folder labeled Wirecard Anomalies. He pored over Malaysian and Philippine corporate registries, comparing addresses, owners, and bank guarantees. Some subsidiaries shared the same dingy mailbox in a Manila shopping mall. Others listed directors who, when called, insisted they had never heard of Wirecard. In early 2019, McCrum's team published an exposé describing forged contracts and fake customers. Wirecard thundered back with lawsuits and press releases accusing the newspaper of colluding with short sellers. German regulators unusually sided with the company. They banned investors from betting against Wirecard stock and launched a criminal probe into the journalists. The message was clear. Wirecard was the pride of German tech. Doubting it bordered on treason. Inside the company, Chief Operating Officer Jan Marsalek projected icy calm. Athletic and fluent in 5 languages, Marsalek cultivated an air of mystery. He boasted of off-the-record trips to Libya, of private meetings with Russian intelligence, of cryptocurrency projects that would redefine trust. To nervous junior managers he offered a mantra: just deliver the numbers. Those numbers, however, were growing harder to conjure. Each new acquisition demanded fresh cash. Each audit asked for thicker evidence that Asian partners really held the balances Wirecard claimed. The solution was as old as fraud itself. Invent the balances and find a bank willing, or naive, enough to confirm them. Enter two small Philippine banks, BPI and BDO. Wirecard said they safeguarded 1.9 billion euros in escrow accounts on behalf of its payment clients. Year after year, auditors from Ernst & Young accepted photocopied letters, stamped and signed, attesting to the money's existence. It was only when a skeptical contingent insisted on calling Manila directly that the illusion began to tear. On the 16th of June 2020, a quizzical clerk at BPI told EY's German audit partner that the letter he held was not authentic. A similar call to BDO produced a terse statement: "We have no relationship with Wirecard." 48 hours later, EY refused to sign the annual accounts. Marcus Braun stood before cameras in Munich, cheeks pale under studio lights, and acknowledged the possibility that 1.9 billion euros may not exist. The markets reacted like a dam had burst. Wirecard shares, once 190 euros, collapsed to 15 euros in 2 days, then to pennies. Braun was arrested for balance sheet manipulation but released on €5 million bail. Marsalek said he was traveling on business and vanished, last tracked boarding a private jet from Austria to Minsk under a false name. Interpol later placed him on its most wanted list. Curiously, Wirecard's employees kept reporting to work even as police cleared desks for evidence. Engineers who had built perfectly functional payment gateways wondered how the success they touched daily could coexist with a void of almost 2 billion euros. A young product manager described the mood as a ship still under power with the engine room flooded. Parliamentary hearings soon revealed why the fraud had endured so long. Germany's financial watchdog, BaFin, had assigned only a single junior officer to monitor Wirecard, a company handling billions in global transactions, because it was technically classified as a technology firm, not a financial institution. Ministers admitted they had celebrated Wirecard's rise so loudly that they became blind to its faults. The most chilling discovery arrived when investigators compared server logs with bank statements. Many of the Asian customers whose payments supposedly flowed through Wirecard's gateways were defunct gambling sites, their domains registered minutes before quarter end, their traffic little more than scripted bots clicking pay now in endless loops. The revenue these bots generated was booked as real, then padded by phony cash confirmations from partner trustees. Auditors, lulled by previous clean opinions, looked no deeper. By August 2020, Wirecard AG entered insolvency, Europe's first DAX-listed company to do so. Employees scattered, though some engineers were rehired by rival fintechs grateful for their skills. Marcus Braun sits in a Munich jail awaiting trial, still insisting that the missing billions were stolen by third parties. Jan Marsalek remains a specter in intelligence rumors, perhaps in Moscow under the protection of the GRU, perhaps nowhere at all. In the end, the story of Wirecard reads like a financial ghost tale. The bigger the lie, the harder it becomes to see, because people stop looking. Regulators feared damaging a national champion, auditors feared losing a lucrative client, investors feared missing the next tech rocket, and so a vacuum of almost 2 billion euros passed as solid fact for half a decade. Only when a diligent reporter, a skeptical auditor, and a clerk in Manila compared notes did the emptiness echo loud enough to shatter the facade. Tonight, the silver letters have been removed from the Munich tower, leaving only faint outlines against the glass. Commuters pass without glancing up, but the building keeps a silent vigil, a reminder that numbers can be forged, signatures copied, and trust, once spent, is harder to locate than a missing 1.9 billion euros. The Whisper Fund on Lexington Avenue. Twilight draped New York City in pale gold when Harvey Silverman, investment columnist for a mid-sized financial daily, first heard the name of Bernard L. Madoff uttered with hushed reverence. The setting was a private charity gala at the Metropolitan Club. Between clinks of crystal, a hedge fund manager bragged that his family foundation had an inside track with Bernie and never posted a losing quarter. Harvey, a man trained to raise an eyebrow at everlasting sunshine, filed the claim away like a loose thread on an otherwise expensive suit. Madoff's offices, tucked inside the Lipstick Building on Lexington Avenue, looked perfectly ordinary: gray carpet, ergonomic chairs, rows of Bloomberg terminals. Yet visitors emerged with the serenity of acolytes leaving a chapel. They spoke of consistent returns, steady, soothing 12 to 13% year after year, rain or shine. No bold promises, just a perpetual hum of moderate profit. It felt, as one pension fund trustee put it, like earning interest from gravity. The fund's allure rested on scarcity. Prospective investors endured waiting lists reminiscent of exclusive country clubs. Madoff would sometimes decline a deposit, waving it away with a grandfatherly smile, which only sharpened appetite. The rare chance to get in conferred status on New England prep schools, European aristocrats, and retirees from Boca Raton who dined on early bird specials while boasting of their personal friendship with Bernie. For Harvey, the puzzle deepened when he tried to trace the fund's trades. Madoff claimed to use a split-strike conversion strategy on blue-chip stocks, hedged by options on the S&P 100. Yet option market veterans whispered that the volumes required to support tens of billions under management never appeared on the tape. Maybe he's doing them OTC, someone suggested. Or maybe, another quipped, he's a magician. 2 floors below headquarters, inside a locked room accessible by only a few, the real magic unfolded. There, a decades-old IBM mid-range computer produced trade confirmations out of thin air. Frank DePascali, Madoff's loyal lieutenant, checked off figures by hand, ensuring each client statement gleamed with plausible strikes and settlement dates. The reports looked just technical enough to discourage deeper questions. Meanwhile, actual funds flowed in a slow, silent circle. New deposits paid older withdrawals, the classic choreography of a Ponzi scheme. Regulators had brushed shoulders with the truth more than once. In 1999, a derivatives expert named Harry Markopolos mailed the SEC a memo bluntly titled, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." Markopolos had tried to replicate Madoff's results and concluded the numbers could only be fabricated. His warning landed with a soft thud. Examiners performed brief visits, asked polite questions, and left impressed by the firm's veneer of order. After all, Bernard Madoff had chaired NASDAQ. Who would suspect the shepherd of devouring the flock? Harvey finally pressed for an interview. Madoff greeted him in a mahogany-paneled conference room, offering espresso in Limoges porcelain. The financier answered questions with patient courtesy, sprinkling talk of market microstructure and order flow. He cited his proprietary black box for timing trades and smiled at the notion that anyone could reverse engineer it. Harvey left with quotes for a flattering profile but also with a quiet itch. Every explanation sounded polished, yet none revealed how profits were actually generated. Winter of 2008 arrived like a guillotine across Wall Street. Lehman Brothers had collapsed, credit markets froze, and frightened investors everywhere demanded cash. At the Lipstick Building, redemptions flooded in at a pace no Ponzi can endure. Madoff arranged emergency meetings with loyal feeders, hinting that the SEC was breathing down his neck and withdrawals must pause. Some clients, rattled by turbulence elsewhere, complied. Others insisted on their money. On December 9th, Bernie summoned his 2 adult sons, Mark and Andrew, to the apartment on East 64th Street. Snow pressed against the windows. He confessed that the investment advisory business was just one big lie. The figure was staggering, about $65 billion including phantom gains. The sons, stunned, consulted an attorney and alerted federal authorities. The next afternoon, FBI agents arrived. One asked whether Madoff had an innocent explanation. Madoff shook his head. "It's all one big Ponzi scheme," he replied, voice thin as the winter light. News detonated across time zones. Foundations evaporated overnight. University endowments stared at gaping holes. Families who thought themselves comfortably middle class faced selling homes. In a Palm Beach cafe, retirees watched cable news in silence, coffee cups cooling as they recalculated the remainder of their lives. European private banks scrambled to reassure clients, only to discover internal exposure that dwarfed their capital buffers. Harvey walked the shuttered newsroom corridors, drafts rustling like fallen leaves. He had documented dozens of scandals, yet none felt as brutally intimate. Here was a fraud built not on exotic derivatives or complex leverage, but on trust, golf course handshakes, synagogue camaraderie, charity gala photographs. The victims were not naive. They were simply soothed by familiarity and a steady drip of good news. In court, Madoff stood in a charcoal suit, thin-lipped and unshaven. He pleaded guilty without a deal, sparing his family a protracted trial yet offering little solace. The judge, outraged by the scope of betrayal, handed down a 150-year sentence. Cameras flashed, onlookers exhaled. But the real punishment, some said, was the erasure of a lifetime persona carefully varnished over decades. Months later, clawback lawsuits lumbered through the system, attempting to redistribute whatever scraps remained. Irving Picard, the trustee, pursued feeder funds and individual investors who had withdrawn gains, arguing that fictitious profits must be returned for equitable restitution. Families who believed they had escaped suddenly found themselves owing millions they no longer possessed. On a rainy March evening, Harvey visited the now vacant Madoff office. The sign had been removed, dust coated the reception desk. In the smallest cubicle, he noticed a discarded client statement dated years earlier, columns of numbers, each evoking a trade that never took place. The paper felt oddly heavy, as if weighted by all the unwritten stories of vigilance surrendered and questions unasked. Outside, traffic hissed along Lexington Avenue, oblivious to the echoes inside. Harvey folded the statement and slipped it into his notebook, not as a souvenir but as a reminder. Fraud, he reflected, rarely begins with audacity. It starts with convenience, reinforced by reputation, and is sustained by the quiet complicity of those who find comfort in believing. And somewhere behind thick prison walls, an aging man confronted a harsher truth, that the greatest con had been convincing himself he would never be caught. The Singapore positions. Evening rain drummed on the glass facade of Baring's Singapore office when a junior risk clerk noticed something odd. A trade ticket stamped "Error Account 88888" bore no corrective entry. The clerk hesitated, then filed the paper away. Someone else's mystery. 2 floors above, in a fluorescent-lit dealing room, 28-year-old derivatives trader Nick Leeson gazed at a bank of monitors, index finger hovering over the buy key. He had been up since dawn, nursing black coffee and a private conviction that a single bold wager could restore the sheen of Britain's oldest merchant bank. 6 months earlier, Tokyo's Nikkei 225 had drifted sideways, frustrating speculators. Leeson, both head trader and back-office supervisor, an arrangement no prudent bank should allow, discovered a loophole. By routing losing trades into account 88888, he could park mistakes out of sight while recording winners in the main ledger. Senior managers in London, dazzled by his reported profits, sent congratulatory faxes and ever larger limits. They dubbed him the star on boat quay. Night after night, Leeson adjusted spreadsheets to conceal swelling losses. Each keystroke felt minor. Collectively they built a dam straining against reality. He reasoned that one market swing could still erase the deficit if only he doubled, then tripled his positions. Futures on Japanese equity, straddles on indexes, options layered like tiles. He bought them all, convinced the sun would rise in his favor. In January 1995, a tremor rattled the Kansai region. The Kobe earthquake toppled highways and sent shock waves through global exchanges. The Nikkei plunged. Leeson, who had bet on a rebound, watched red figures blossom across his screens like arterial bursts. He swallowed panic and typed in fresh orders, leveraging Baring's ever deeper. Meanwhile, account 88888 bled. Losses crossed £200 million, then £400 million, sums large enough to anchor a fleet of cargo ships. Back in London, Baring's board reveled in headlines hailing their Far East wunderkind. They noted only that Singapore required a modest capital infusion to support growth. Compliance teams, lulled by tidy monthly reports, asked no hard questions. No one flew out to reconcile the books in person. The notion that a single trader could sink a venerable institution founded before Queen Victoria took the throne felt absurd. By mid-February, Leeson felt the net closing. Clearinghouses demanded margin he could not post. Each dawn he paced the quay outside the office, humid air heavy with diesel and jasmine, weighing escape fantasies against the tightening coil of obligation. He proposed to his wife, Lisa, also a Baring's employee, that they take a weekend in Malaysia to clear their heads. She agreed, unaware of the storm barricaded behind her husband's eyes. On February 23, Leeson faxed London a cryptic note. Due to unforeseen events, losses are about £500 million. The figure exceeded Baring's entire trading capital. Executives stared at the paper, hearts sputtering, then boarded the next flight east. In Singapore, regulators detained Leeson's staff, sealed file cabinets, and mirrored hard drives. But the architect of the vortex was gone. He had slipped onto a red-eye to Kuala Lumpur, clutching a passport and a single carry-on bag. News agencies broke the story on a grey Monday. Commuters in London paused under awnings to study headlines. Baring's bank collapses under £827 million loss. The figure ballooned as auditors traced every concealed ticket. At 6 p.m., the Bank of England declared Baring's insolvent. Employees spilled from the stately Bishopsgate headquarters, cardboard boxes in hand, faces blank with disbelief. On a balmy Jakarta layover, Leeson scanned television bulletins, jaw tightening. He wired a terse apology to his superiors, then boarded a flight to Frankfurt, hoping to disappear into Europe. German police, tipped off, arrested him at the gate. Cameras flashed. The young man in handcuffs looked more bewildered than dangerous, as if still computing where audacity had deposited him. Extradited to Singapore, Leeson faced a courtroom where ceiling fans stirred humid air and prosecutors catalogued his deceptions. He pleaded guilty, accepting a 6.5-year sentence. Reporters noted the irony. The prison overlooked the very trading floor where his rise had begun. Back in Britain, Queen Elizabeth's bankers convened emergency meetings. NG, a Dutch concern, acquired bearings for the ceremonial price of £1, assuming its debt like a surgeon transplanting a failing heart. Centuries-old business cards became collectors' curiosities. Marble corridors were rechristened with a new logo. Employees who once toasted decades of tradition stood in unemployment queues, still processing the speed of implosion. From his cell, Leeson granted occasional interviews. He spoke of pressure, of a culture that prized profit over prudence, of supervisors who applauded success yet never lifted the veil. He admitted he might have confessed earlier if only someone had asked the right question in the right tone. Instead, silence had grown thick enough to hide a canyon. When release came in 1999, his body thinned by cancer diagnosed behind bars, Leeson stepped into tropical daylight, blinking at a world that had moved on. Tech stocks now dominated headlines, promising returns that echoed the same siren notes once piped through Barings corridors. Auditors tightened protocols, banks erected Chinese walls between trading and settlement, and textbooks etched the tale as a cautionary shard of 20th century finance. Yet late in distant offices, risk officers still fight drowsy eyes, skimming exception reports, trusting that serious discrepancies happen elsewhere. Leeson's ghost hovers there, a reminder etched in fluorescent glare. Sometimes catastrophe begins as a single unchecked ticket, filed away on a rainy night by someone too polite to pursue a question. The billionaire mirage, Alan Stanford and the Caribbean Ponzi scheme. At first glance, Sir Alan Stanford appeared to be the embodiment of American success. With his salt and pepper beard, Texan charm, and a private jet fleet stamped with his personal crest, he commanded the room like a man born to power. He hosted lavish cricket tournaments, donated to universities, shook hands with presidents, and was even knighted by the Antiguan government. His empire, the Stanford Financial Group, promised safety and sophistication to thousands of investors around the world. At the heart of it was a seemingly simple offer: high-yield certificates of deposit, CDs, issued through his offshore bank in Antigua, offering returns far above any American bank. What few knew was that the money was never being invested. It was fueling a fraud that would become the second-largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Stanford's pitch was irresistible to many. The CDs, marketed through his subsidiary Stanford International Bank, offered steady returns of 10% or more, supposedly derived from a mix of conservative foreign investments and real estate holdings. The company claimed transparency, safety, and elite banking practices. He built trust through appearances. His Houston offices were dripping in marble. His staff wore uniforms. Clients received glossy brochures and detailed reports outlining portfolio strength and security. He sponsored sports events, political campaigns, and public health programs. It all looked real. By the early 2000s, Stanford controlled more than $7 billion in investor assets. Most of it came from retirees, middle-class professionals, and even churches who had been told their money was being carefully managed overseas. But inside the Stanford empire, it was chaos. The CDs were a lie. Stanford and his inner circle weren't investing the deposits. Instead, they were using the funds to pay earlier investors, classic Ponzi behavior, and to finance Stanford's lavish lifestyle. He purchased private islands, operated a fleet of jets, and lived in a massive estate in the Caribbean. He surrounded himself with models, hosted private parties for celebrities, and claimed he was too big to fail. As the scheme grew, so did his delusions of grandeur. He presented himself as a banking innovator and philanthropic leader. In 2006, he donated millions to promote cricket in the West Indies, famously awarding a $20 million prize to the winning team of a single match. Cameras flashed. Athletes cheered. The illusion deepened. But the cracks began to form as early as 2008, during the global financial crisis. Investors wanted to pull out their money, and Stanford couldn't deliver. Rumors spread. Whistleblowers began talking. A former employee alerted the SEC, describing in detail how the CD program was fabricated. The SEC launched an investigation. In February 2009, the House of Cards collapsed. Stanford was arrested and charged with orchestrating a $7 billion fraud. Prosecutors described his company as a massive Ponzi scheme, one that preyed on trust, appearance, and a network of complicit financial advisors. In court, Stanford denied everything. He claimed the company was legitimate, the investments real, and the charges politically motivated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial statements, and testimony from former executives made it clear. The CDs were worthless, the returns fabricated, and the books cooked for years. In 2012, Alan Stanford was convicted on 13 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The fallout was devastating. More than 21,000 investors across 113 countries lost life savings. Many had been lured in by glowing recommendations from advisors who were paid to push Stanford's products. The Antiguan economy, once bolstered by Stanford's investments, plunged into financial crisis. His knighthood was revoked. His assets were seized. And his name, once tied to prestige, became synonymous with deception. Unlike Bernie Madoff, who expressed some remorse for his crimes, Stanford maintained his innocence to the end. Even in prison, he insisted he was a victim of government overreach. But the numbers told a different story. Billions gone, lives shattered, and a decade-long fraud that operated behind the smoke and mirrors of one man's ego. Stanford's case exposed glaring weaknesses in international banking oversight. His operations in Antigua were largely unregulated, and his American branches functioned with minimal scrutiny. By spreading his empire across jurisdictions, he had stayed one step ahead, until he couldn't. In the end, Alan Stanford didn't just steal money. He stole security, hope, and trust. He created a fantasy, then sold it to the world. And for a time, the world believed him. The towers of mirrored glass. Houston's autumn heat still pressed against the sidewalks when a junior accountant named Maria Cortez walked past two glass spires bearing a single name in brushed steel, Enron. The towers shimmered like prisms, reflecting blue sky and the faint promise of limitless energy markets. Inside, elevator music drifted over conversations about weather futures, broadband pipelines, and a coming era where utilities would trade like high-octane stocks. To visitors, the atmosphere felt part space program, part casino. Maria's cubicle sat on the 25th floor, just one corridor away from the finance group run by Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow. On her first week, she received a thick orientation binder that praised asset-light innovation and mark-to-market freedom. The phrases sounded visionary, though she sensed they were also intentionally vague. When she asked the supervisor how a pipeline under construction could already deliver booked profit, he smiled and said, "We recognize value the moment we create the opportunity." Quarter after quarter, Enron's earnings never dipped. Analysts compared its steady ascent to a rocket escaping gravity. Fastow, buoyant and quick-witted, toured the trading floor in shirt sleeves, high-fiving clerks after a big deal closed. His secret toolkit lay not in the commodities themselves, but in a warren of shell companies with jaunty names, LGM, Jedi, Chuko, that orbited the parent firm like moons masking craters. These partnerships bought Enron's weak assets at prices set by Enron, then financed the purchases with bank loans backed by Enron stock. Everyone won, until anyone asked too many questions. The first tremor arrived one humid Friday when a risk analyst noticed that the LJM entities now owned hundreds of millions in faltering fiber optic investments. If Enron's share price slipped, the guarantees behind those loans would snap. She drafted a memo and routed it up the chain. Somewhere between cubicles and corner offices, the memo vanished. When she inquired, a manager advised her to focus on the bright side. Long-term growth is bulletproof. In August 2001, Corporate Vice President Sharon Watkins typed a private 6-page letter to CEO Ken Lay. Her tone was loyal yet urgent. "I am incredibly nervous," she wrote, "that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals." She listed partnerships whose very purpose seemed to be hiding debt, questioned rosy valuations, and warned that Fastow's dual role as buyer and seller reeked of conflict. Watkins sealed the letter in an interoffice envelope and returned to her desk, pulse racing. Lay read the warning, consulted outside lawyers, and convened brief meetings. Rather than trigger a public reckoning, he reassured deputies that everything remained under control. A memo went out praising robust governance and reminding staff to keep delivering value. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, skeptical fund managers began building quiet short positions against the soaring stock, murmuring that the numbers glowed too brightly. October brought a chill to Texas evenings and to Enron's balance sheet. An earnings release disclosed a mysterious $1 billion write-down linked to structured finance vehicles. Analysts blinked at the jargon, then peppered executives on the conference call. Each answer spoke of temporary adjustments and portfolio optimization, yet confidence slipped. The share price dipped below $40, having in weeks. Fasto, suddenly radioactive, stepped down. He left the building clutching a box of family photos, still insisting that his structures had saved, not doomed, the company. Arthur Andersen, Enron's longtime auditor, dispatched senior partners to review the carnage. 4 years Andersen advisors had worked side by side with Enron accountants, sometimes drafting memos on the very schemes they were meant to police. Now, faced with subpoenas, they ordered shredders plugged in before dawn. Bags of confetti-like strips piled waist-high, each slip once part of a contract or an email chain about LJM's real purpose. Maria, watching from her cubicle, felt the mood shift from fluorescent optimism to icy dread. Elevator chatter turned to whispers about severance packages and frozen 401k plans. She pulled her own retirement statement. Every contribution invested in Enron shares, the default option praised at orientation. The number had shrunk with sinister speed. On November 8th, a rival energy firm offered a rescue merger. Due diligence teams marched through data rooms but recoiled when they saw the abyss fastened beneath the surface. Within days, the deal collapsed. Rating agencies slashed Enron's credit to junk, triggering clauses that forced immediate repayment of billions, money the company did not possess. At 5 a.m. on December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 protection, the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time. The mirrored towers that once dazzled passers-by now reflected only gray winter clouds. Thousands of employees were escorted out with cardboard boxes. Many discovered their life savings erased. Pensioners across the country opened envelopes to find futures rewritten by zeros. Federal investigators fanned out, tracing partnerships, decoding spreadsheets, interviewing traders who once bet on everything from natural gas spikes to snowfall in New England. They pieced together a portrait of systemic deceit, profits plucked from thin air, debt buried under layers of friendly entities, executives cashing out stock options while urging employees to buy more. Fasto pleaded guilty first, exchanging testimony for a reduced sentence. In court, he described how each special-purpose vehicle had been handcrafted to keep losses off Enron's books. Jurors listened as if to an architect explaining hidden passageways inside a grand mansion. Other executives followed, some defiant, others contrite. Ken Lay, awaiting sentencing, suffered a fatal heart attack on a Colorado vacation trail. Skilling, the former CEO who once declared that Enron was asset-heavy on ideas, received a long term in federal prison. Andersen, once one of the Big Five audit firms, crumbled after a jury verdict of obstruction, its workforce scattering overnight. Years later, wildflowers grew in planters outside the glass towers, now leased to modest tenants needing only a fraction of the space. Maria, having rebuilt her career elsewhere, sometimes drove past the site at dusk. The windows still shimmered, but she knew the trick of light. Reflections could suggest depth where none existed. Fraud, she reflected, seldom relied on complex mathematics. It thrived on ordinary hopes. The wish to believe in miracles, the comfort of rising numbers, the lullaby of leadership speeches. As night settled over Houston, new employees in other high-rise offices refreshed spreadsheets, confident in controls their predecessors never imagined breaching. Yet somewhere in the plumbing of modern finance, another scheme likely germinated, quiet as a seed beneath asphalt, waiting for the right mixture of ambition and inattention to let its first deceptive shoot break the surface. The flickering lights of Houston. Houston's skyline gleams brightest after sundown, when the mirrored towers along Smith Street glow like upright lanterns. At the turn of the millennium, the tallest and most radiant belonged to Enron, a company that promised to light the world by trading not just natural gas and electricity but, as its executives like to say, pure energy itself. Commuters driving the Katy Freeway could see the corporate logo pulsing in sapphire neon, an emblem of Texas optimism and deregulated ambition. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost collegiate. Open floors, glass cubicles, employees in jeans tossing Nerf footballs while screens streamed market data faster than anyone could blink. Executives encouraged what they called loose-tight culture. Casual in dress, ruthless in targets. If an idea couldn't be monetized within 6 months, it was dropped. If it could, the champion received stock options that minted millionaires overnight. Analysts dubbed Enron the most innovative company in America 6 years in a row, and its CEO, Jeffrey Skilling, soaked in the praise with a quick grin that never quite reached his eyes. Behind the charisma, however, numbers strained to keep up with rhetoric. Enron's core gas trading business delivered real profits, but nowhere near the hyper-growth Wall Street had been promised. To bridge the gap, Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow designed a latticework of special-purpose entities, shell companies with names like LJM and Raptors. These entities bought underperforming Enron assets at inflated prices, booked gains on the parent company's balance sheet, and hid corresponding losses behind a curtain of off-balance sheet debt. Fastow pocketed finders' fees, auditors ticked through checklists, and quarterly earnings appeared as smooth as polished marble. Red flags did flutter. A young accountant asked why every deal closed in the final hours of each quarter. A risk manager noticed that market-to-market valuations always drifted upward, never down, as though gravity itself had been renegotiated. When she raised concerns, a superior advised her to stop acting like a cop and focus on closing trades. Promotions went to those who executed, not those who questioned. Skilling's most audacious project emerged in 2000. Enron Broadband Services, an online marketplace for leasing and used fiber optic capacity. The venture had no functioning platform, yet Skilling promised it would do for bandwidth what eBay did for collectibles. At a lavish analyst conference in the Renaissance Hotel, engineers demoed a streaming video of a parrot flapping its wings in real time. What the audience didn't know was that the feed ran on a closed local network. The global backbone was nowhere near ready. Still, the stock jumped on cue, and employees clipped the parrot's image into celebratory emails. Meanwhile, in a small cubicle at Fortune magazine, reporter Bethany McLean studied Enron's latest 10K filing. A former Goldman Sachs analyst, she admired the company's swagger but couldn't reconcile its climbing market cap with its razor-thin cash flow. In March 2001, she published a politely worded article titled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" A pebble tossed into the gulf that went mostly unnoticed. Enron's head of investor relations called McLean unethical and suggested she simply didn't get it. Yet doubt, once seeded, tends to sprout. Short sellers combed through the same SEC filings and traced the labyrinth of Fastow's entities. Some discovered that Enron guaranteed those shells with its own stock, an arrangement that could implode if prices fell. In August 2001, Skilling abruptly resigned for personal reasons, leaving founder Ken Lay to reassure analysts that nothing fundamental had changed. Behind closed doors, Lay urged employees to keep buying the stock, even as he offloaded millions of dollars worth of his own shares. The market finally blinked in October when Enron announced a mysterious $1.2 billion equity reduction linked to related party transactions. 12 days later, the company restated 5 years of earnings, wiping out nearly $600 million in reported profit. Credit agencies slashed ratings to near junk. Trading partners, suddenly wary, demanded cash collateral for contracts that had long been secured by Enron's reputation alone. Each day, Treasury staff wired out tens of millions more than came in, the corporate equivalent of a hemorrhage. Employees felt the shift first in the building's cafeteria, where the mood turned from high fives to hollow jokes about resumes. Darla, a payroll specialist, noticed that executives who once swaggered through the lobby now slipped out side doors carrying cardboard boxes. On November 30th, Dynegy withdrew from a last-minute rescue merger, citing unresolved issues. 4 days later, Enron filed for Chapter 11, the largest bankruptcy in American history at that time. Revelations followed with the relentlessness of dripping water. Arthur Andersen, Enron's auditor, had shredded boxes of working papers after learning the SEC was sniffing around. The firm collapsed under obstruction of justice charges. Fastow pled guilty to fraud and became the prosecution's star witness, detailing how he manipulated spreadsheets so lenders never saw the same debt twice. Skilling was convicted on 19 counts of conspiracy and securities fraud. Lay was found guilty as well, though he died of a heart attack before sentencing. Thousands of employees, whose retirement savings were locked almost entirely in Enron stock, watched nest eggs dissolve to pennies while executives retained bonuses paid weeks before the crash. Congress promised reforms, delivering the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, a statute that now governs every public company's internal controls. Critics argue that paperwork multiplied but human nature stayed the same. Houston's economy rebounded, its skyline still brilliant, yet older residents point to the vacant floor numbers in certain elevators, the ones Enron once filled, and remember nights when the city glowed a little too brightly. Years later, a former trader returned to the now-leased office space and rode the glass elevator silently to the 49th floor. The walls had been repainted, the trading desks removed, but if he closed his eyes he could almost hear the old chorus of ringing phones, the shouted bids, the confident laughs echoing down the aisles. Then he opened them, saw only sunlight on clean carpet, and understood that confidence, unmoored from truth, flickers like a bulb before it burns out. Tonight, drivers along the Katy freeway still see towers lit in neon, but none bear the Enron E. The skyline endures, steadier, perhaps wiser, yet mindful of the season when a company tried to trade energy's future and instead became a cautionary tale whispered wherever quarterly numbers look a shade too polished to be entirely real. The Swiss Bank Heist, The Art of Deception by Gerard Tessin. Switzerland has long been synonymous with banking secrecy, stability, and trust. Its banks, nestled in the shadow of the Alps, have served as guardians of some of the world's largest fortunes. The polished marble halls of Geneva and Zurich hold billions in assets, with privacy assured as a fundamental right. For many wealthy clients, Swiss banks represent security and discretion. But even in this fortress of financial confidence, cracks can appear, sometimes carved by the very people entrusted to protect it. Gerard Tessin was one such individual. A French-born accountant with impeccable credentials, he joined a prestigious Swiss private bank in Geneva in the early 2000s. His role was ostensibly straightforward: to manage complex client portfolios, advise ultra-wealthy customers on their investments, and maintain the bank's reputation for discretion and reliability. But Tessin was not content with merely doing his job. Over time he grew increasingly emboldened. With privileged access to client accounts and internal banking systems, he began crafting an elaborate scheme to steal from the very clients he was supposed to serve. What made Tessin's fraud so insidious was its complexity and subtlety. Unlike brazen theft or obvious embezzlement, Tessin worked quietly behind the scenes, exploiting his deep knowledge of accounting, auditing, and Swiss banking protocols to cover his tracks. He created fictitious accounts in the names of shell companies, carefully layered with false documents and forged signatures. Transactions were routed through an intricate network of offshore entities in Europe and the Caribbean, designed to obscure the origin and destination of funds. By manipulating the bank's internal records, Tessin masked unauthorized withdrawals and asset transfers as legitimate investment activity. For years the scheme went unnoticed. Client statements appeared accurate and balanced, and Tessin's colleagues regarded him as meticulous and trustworthy. Even internal audits failed to detect the irregularities. The forged documents and expertly falsified reports gave no cause for suspicion. The total amount stolen grew into the hundreds of millions, with estimates exceeding $150 million. The funds financed an opulent lifestyle far removed from the humble accountant's beginnings. Luxury homes, high-end vehicles, and investments in art and real estate all flowed from the illicit gains. Yet no deception lasts forever. The first sign of trouble emerged when a newly appointed compliance officer spotted subtle discrepancies in client account statements during a routine review. Certain wire transfers did not match corresponding records. Some signatures on documents appeared inconsistent. These small flags prompted a deeper investigation. Swiss financial authorities quickly became involved, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in France, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. The tangled web of shell companies and cross-border transfers made the probe challenging and lengthy. In 2010, after months of surveillance and forensic accounting, Gerard Tessin was arrested at his home in France. His computers and personal files contained mountains of fabricated documents, spreadsheets, and emails detailing the cover-up. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who used his professional expertise to betray trust on a grand scale. Tessin maintained he had started with good intentions but had become ensnared in a spiral of greed and deception. The court sentenced him to over 10 years in prison, marking one of the most significant private banking fraud convictions in Swiss history. The repercussions were profound. The scandal damaged the reputation of Swiss private banking, once considered untouchable. It triggered regulatory reforms aimed at increasing transparency, strengthening compliance, and imposing stricter oversight on account managers and back-office operations. Clients became more cautious, demanding better audits and verification. Banks began collaborating more closely with international authorities to prevent money laundering and financial crimes. Gerard Tessin's story is a stark reminder that even the most trusted institutions are vulnerable when ambition and greed intersect with opportunity. It illustrates how a single individual, armed with skill and insider access, can exploit systemic weaknesses to devastating effect. More than a crime of numbers, it is a tale of betrayal, of trust shattered behind the velvet curtains of privilege. In the world of high finance, where millions change hands in seconds, vigilance remains the only defense against the art of deception.